This isn't my story, but something that happened to a good friend of mine. Let's call her Jess. Jess was driving home from her parents' house late one night, like she'd done plenty of times before. The road was one of those isolated, rural routes in southern Germany, surrounded by dense trees on both sides and the occasional empty field. It was peaceful in its own way, with the night so still and quiet, you could almost hear your own thoughts. Jess enjoyed the solitude, finding it calming, that is, until things took a strange turn. About halfway through her trip, she noticed something odd in the distance, lying in the middle of the road. As her headlights illuminated it, she realized it was a large log. Jess was annoyed more than anything. The log was blocking her way, and with the road being a narrow one-lane stretch, she had no choice but to stop and move it herself. The idea of backing up and trying to find an alternate route wasn't appealing. It would add at least another hour to her already long drive. So, she parked the car, left the engine running, and got out to take care of it. The night air was cold and still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jess walked up to the log, grabbed it, and began dragging it off the road. It was heavy, but she managed, her breath puffing out in the chilly air. As she wiped her hands on her jeans, she noticed something in her peripheral vision: headlights. Another car was coming up behind hers, maybe 30 feet away. It stopped, and Jess didn't think much of it, assuming they were just waiting for her to clear the road. She got back into her car and continued driving, but the car behind her didn't pass. It followed her. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. After all, this was a lonely stretch of road, and there weren't many places to go. Still, as the minutes ticked by and the car stayed behind her, Jess began to feel uneasy. It wasn't tailgating, but it wasn't backing off either, just keeping a steady pace, the headlights looming in her rearview mirror. She tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were heading in the same direction, nothing more. But as they drove through the next town, the car stayed with her, never making a turn, never falling back. Jess's anxiety grew with every passing minute. It was late, the streets were dark, and there was no one else around. Something about the situation felt off. Her heartbeat quickened as she tried to think of what to do. She didn't want to drive straight to her house. It felt too risky now. What if they really were following her? She couldn't take the chance of leading them to her home. She called the police, informing them about the situation and that she's driving home so that they can intercept the stranger as soon as they arrive at her home address. Finally, Jess decided to pull over a few blocks away from her place. She wanted to see if they'd pass her by or if this was something more sinister. She parked on the side of the road and watched, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited, holding her breath. But the car didn't pass. Instead, it pulled up right behind hers, parking just a few feet away. Panic surged through Jess. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She didn't know who was in that car, and now they were sitting right behind her in the middle of an empty street. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure, a man, sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't get out right away, which only made things worse. What was he waiting for? What did he want? After what felt like an eternity, the man opened his door and stepped out. Jess's heart was in her throat as she watched him approach her car. He was tall and moved with a deliberate pace, not like someone who was lost or just needed help. There was something purposeful about the way he walked, and Jess felt a knot of fear tightening in her chest. He reached her window and started gesturing, pointing toward the back of her car. Jess couldn't make out what he was trying to say, but she didn't want to open her door, didn't want to give him any chance to get closer. Instead, she cracked her window just a bit, enough to hear him without fully exposing herself. The man was frantically pointing at her trunk, his voice muffled but urgent. Jess was confused. What was he trying to tell her? She squinted through the gap in the window, trying to make sense of his gestures, but then he did something that made her blood run cold. He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen, a recent call to the police. Her mind was spinning now. Why would he call the police? What was happening? The man spoke again, louder this time, his words finally registering. He'd been following her because, while she was moving the log, he saw someone sneak into the trunk of her car. Jess felt the world tilt for a moment, her stomach dropping as the realization hit her. Her car was a hatchback, meaning the trunk wasn't separated from the rest of the car. Someone had been hiding in the back the entire time, just a few feet away from her, and she hadn't noticed. She felt sick. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped her phone. She immediately got out of the truck and moved a few feet away, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to process what the man was telling her. The whole time she'd been driving, there had been someone lying in wait, just out of sight. If the man behind her hadn't followed to warn her, who knows what could have happened? The minutes that followed felt like hours. Jess was on edge, watching as the man backed away from her car, his eyes flicking between her and the trunk. She didn't dare move, just stood there, clutching her phone, waiting for the police. It wasn't long before they arrived, but to Jess, it felt like a lifetime. When the officers finally approached, they did so cautiously. Jess could barely breathe as they popped open the trunk. And there, curled up in the back, was a man. He'd been hiding there the whole time, waiting for who knows what opportunity. The police quickly dragged him out, handcuffed him, and led him away, but Jess couldn't shake the terror that had settled deep in her bones. She never found out what his plan was. The police didn't tell her much, just that he had a criminal record. Maybe he was planning a robbery, or maybe it was something far worse. Either way, Jess couldn't stop thinking about how close she had come to bringing him home with her, to being alone in that house with him lurking in the trunk. It was around New Year's when Amy and I decided to do something different for a date. I was 20, and she had just turned 18. We'd been dating for about 3 months, and things were still in that exciting stage where everything felt new. We met online through some multiplayer game I'd been into at the time, and we hit it off immediately. She lived a little way out of city, but that wasn't a big deal. We made time for each other. Instead of going to one of those fancy restaurants that were packed around the holidays, we decided to grab some fast food and take a long drive. Nothing special, just a bucket of KFC, some fries, and a couple of beer cans. We figured we'd find a quiet spot near the lake in the reserve, park the car, and hang out for a while. It seemed perfect to us, just two people enjoying each other's company. The drive started off fine, though the roads were a little slick from snow earlier in the day. We'd been hearing warnings about more snow, but we weren't too worried. It wasn't supposed to be that bad. It wasn't until we got closer to the reserve that the snow really started coming down hard. The road narrowed, winding through dense woods, and the snow piled up faster than I expected. It became almost impossible to see. I could tell Amy was getting nervous, but I didn't want to ruin the mood by suggesting we head back. So, I kept driving until we found a good spot near the lake. Once we parked, things started to settle down. We put on a movie, grabbed the snacks, and everything felt cozy. The car windows fogged up, and the only light came from the dim screen on my phone. Outside, everything was silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was just us, alone in the reserve, no other cars, no people. Honestly, it felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. But that quiet? It didn't last. Out of nowhere, there was this loud crash, like something heavy had fallen nearby. The sound was sharp and echoed through the stillness, cutting right into our peaceful moment. We both froze, caught off guard by how loud it was. I glanced at Amy, but she shrugged, probably thinking it was just some branch or maybe an animal. The reserve wasn't exactly known for its wildlife, but anything seemed possible out here. After a second, we laughed it off and went back to the movie. A little while later, Amy told me she had to use the bathroom. There wasn't anywhere proper to go, and since we were all alone, she figured she could just walk a little way into the woods. The snow had let up a bit by then, and I wasn't going to let her go alone, so I went too. Not that I really needed to go, but I figured I'd join her. I mean, things had been getting kind of heated between us, and I wasn't about to let a bathroom break ruin that vibe. We were almost done when I heard a loud snap behind us. like a branch breaking in two. It was so sudden that I flinched. The air around us felt different after that, colder, like it had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I stood frozen for a moment, listening for anything else, but all I could hear was the wind whistling softly through the trees. Then Amy screamed. I didn't even zip up before I turned around and bolted toward her. She was already running toward the car, her face pale and her breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. By the time I reached her, she was scrambling to get inside. I followed her in and tried to calm her down. It took a few minutes before she could even tell me what had happened. She said that while she was out there, she heard this weird sound, like something heavy being dragged along the ground. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, this slow scraping noise moving through the leaves. She'd always been jumpy, so I figured it was probably just her nerves getting the best of her. But then she mentioned the snap of the branch, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to comfort her, wrapping an arm around her and telling her it was nothing. After a while, she seemed to calm down. She even started laughing again, leaning into me as we watched the rest of the movie. But then, it happened again. Another crash. Louder this time, sharper. It didn't sound like something heavy this time, though. It was more rhythmic, like someone was hitting something over and over again. Amy looked at me with wide eyes, her skin pale and slick with sweat. "It's someone trying to break the ice," she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart dropped. The lake was frozen this time of year. What if someone was out there, trying to break through? Maybe they were fishing, or maybe they weren't. I didn't know what to think, but whatever it was, it freaked Amy out more than anything else. She was begging me to drive us out of there, but all I could feel was this burning frustration. I'd been looking forward to this night for days, and now it was ruined because some idiot was out there banging on ice. I wasn't about to let that slide. I grabbed a flashlight from my phone and stepped out of the car, ignoring Amy's protests. She told me it was a terrible idea, but I wasn't thinking straight. Anger, frustration, and a bit of stupidity clouded my judgment. I picked up a stick that was lying in the snow and told her I'd be back in a few minutes. As soon as I stepped into the woods, though, my confidence started to fade. It was colder than I expected, and the snow was falling faster again, making it hard to see anything more than a few feet ahead. I held the flashlight low, moving cautiously, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the more I realized how dumb this was. Then I saw it. There was a white pickup truck parked just behind the trees, barely visible through the snowfall. My stomach churned. It wasn't supposed to be there. We hadn't passed anyone on our way in, and now, all of a sudden, there was a truck parked out here in the middle of nowhere? Something was wrong. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, a loud splash, like something being thrown into the water. My pulse raced as I froze in place, the cold air burning my lungs with every breath. Then I heard a voice, deep and angry, calling out, "Hey, who are you?" I didn't stick around to answer. I turned and walked as fast as I could back to the car, trying not to slip on the ice or let the panic overtake me. The voice called out again, closer this time, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I got to the car, I slammed the door shut and jammed the key into the ignition. Amy kept asking what had happened, but I didn't say a word. I just put the car in gear and floored it. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, the headlights cutting through the thick snow as we sped down the narrow road. After a while, I told her everything, and she panicked. Then Amy screamed again, pointing at the rearview mirror. A white pickup truck was behind us, its engine roaring and gaining speed. I could barely make out the driver through the snow, but his windshield was fogged up, and the light reflecting off it made him impossible to see. My heart was pounding as I pressed the gas pedal harder. The car skidded a little, fishtailing on the slick road, but I kept going. Amy was dialing the police, telling them what was happening. They told us to head straight to the nearest station. I've never driven so fast in my life. The truck stayed behind us the whole time, close enough that I could see its headlights glaring in the mirrors. Every second felt like an eternity, and all I could think about was how close we were to tipping over. It wouldn't take much, one wrong turn, and we'd be off the road. Finally, after what felt like hours, we pulled into the police station parking lot. The truck didn't stop. It just sped past, disappearing into the night. We told the cops everything, but there wasn't much they could do. No plates, no clear description. It felt like a dead end. Amy broke up with me a month later. She said it was because of my stupid decisions that night, and maybe she was right. But that wasn't the worst part. A week after the breakup, my dad called, and at the time I was out of the city. He said he'd seen a guy on our garage security cam checking out the plates on my car. He was wearing a hoodie, his face hidden, though they had told everything to the police. I didn't need to see his face. I knew who it was. And I'm still not sure what he was really doing out there by the lake. But if the cops had checked the lake for the ice breaking, I bet they would have found something. This happened to me a few years ago, back when I was still in college, trying to balance classes with a job that barely paid enough to keep up with my living expenses and growing student loans. I worked at this small, local restaurant as a pizza delivery guy. It wasn't the best gig. The owner didn't pay much, but it was enough to keep me afloat. I'd been doing it for a while, and though the pay was low, it was easy money, and I could work nights, which fit with my schedule. My girlfriend, Amy, always joked that I spent more time delivering pizzas than studying, which wasn't far from the truth. One late evening, I got an order for 6 pizzas to be delivered out near Navajo National Park in Arizona. That area was pretty common for us since the restaurant was nearby, and I'd delivered to the outskirts of the park plenty of times before. The address wasn't directly inside the park, but it was close, just one of those random, isolated homes on the edge of nowhere. Still, nothing too unusual about it, except that it was already late and the monsoon season had just started. As soon as I set out, the wind had already begun picking up. The sky was dark, and the clouds looked heavy, but it wasn't raining yet. I'd been through storms before, so I wasn't too concerned. I packed up the pizzas and took off on my scooter, hoping to finish the last delivery of the night and get home. After a few minutes, the rain started coming down lightly, just enough to make the road slick but not too bad. The route was familiar, long stretches of open road through the desert, with hardly any streetlights. It always felt eerie driving through that area at night, with the empty road disappearing into the distance, surrounded by nothing but the vast, dark desert. The closer I got to the location, the more isolated it felt. I checked the GPS, and it was leading me to a spot that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, right on the edge of the park. The wind was howling now, and the rain had picked up a bit, making it harder to see. I was already wet, tired, and frustrated by the time I arrived. When I pulled up to the destination, I was immediately unsettled. There wasn't a house in sight. The location was exactly where the GPS said it should be, but there was nothing there, just an empty stretch of dirt road flanked by trees on one side and the open desert on the other. My headlights cast long, eerie shadows over the landscape, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I double-checked the address. It was correct. Annoyed, I parked my scooter and looked around. The rain was starting to soak through my jacket, and the wind was cold. There was no sign of anyone. I thought maybe they'd given the wrong address or something, so I decided to call the number on the order. Then I hit the call. I heard it, a scream. A woman's scream, coming from somewhere out in the desert. My heart skipped a beat. It was loud and desperate, cutting through the sound of the wind and rain like a knife. I froze, my mind racing. For a moment, I considered jumping on my scooter and getting the hell out of there. But then the phone connected, pulling me back to reality. A man answered. He didn't seem alarmed at all, almost like he hadn't heard the scream. I told him I had the pizzas and was at the location, but instead of coming out to meet me, he asked me to describe where I was. That was strange, considering I was standing exactly where the GPS had led me. When I told him that, He paused for a second and then said they were running late but would be there in about 15 minutes. They were celebrating something and would grab the pizzas when they got back. I was pissed off. The whole situation felt wrong, but there wasn't much I could do. I hung up, annoyed, and leaned against my scooter, waiting. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind was howling through the trees. The place was desolate, completely devoid of life, and every second I stood there made me feel more and more uneasy. Then I heard it again, the scream. This time, it was even louder and closer, a woman crying for help, her voice echoing through the empty desert. My stomach dropped, and I felt panic rising in my chest. My mind raced, torn between running and doing something, anything. I couldn't just leave someone out there, could I? But the thought of walking into that darkness, with no clue what was going on, terrified me. Another scream. This one was louder, more urgent, and it felt like it was coming from right behind the line of trees on the side of the road. My adrenaline kicked in, and before I could stop myself, I was sprinting toward the sound, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I ran. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind whipped through the trees, making it difficult to see or hear anything clearly. I kept running, the screams guiding me. But just as I thought I was getting closer, everything stopped. The screaming, the sounds, it was like the entire desert went silent, save for the rain and the wind. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I stood there, drenched, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I heard it, a loud crash, like rocks being smashed together, and everything went quiet again. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I didn't want to be there anymore. I turned around and started running back toward the road, slipping and stumbling on the wet ground. My mind was racing with horrible thoughts. What if someone was out there? What if I was next? My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. It was the man who had ordered the pizzas, asking where I was. He said he was standing by my scooter, wondering where I'd gone. My blood turned cold. I asked him if he'd heard the screams, but he dodged the question, asking instead about the pizzas and how long I'd be. I ended the call without answering, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I sprinted back toward my scooter, slipping and sliding in the mud, my heart racing. When I finally reached it, there was no one there, and the box of pizzas was gone. My scooter was the only thing on the side of the road, sitting there like nothing had happened. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. I didn't waste any time. I hopped on my scooter and sped off, the rain pouring down harder than ever. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. By the time I reached the restaurant, I was soaked, shaken, and out of breath. I tried explaining what had happened to my boss, but he didn't believe me. Instead, he fired me on the spot for not bringing back the money from the delivery. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. A week later, while scrolling through YouTube, I stumbled upon a news report. A woman's body had been found in the national park, badly decomposed, partially buried after the heavy rains. My stomach turned as I realized that the screams I'd heard that night were probably hers. The men who ordered those pizzas, they were the ones responsible for whatever had happened to her. Click here to watch 3 real, truly disturbing horror stories about hiking.